Thank you for joining us for Eye on New Mexico today. I'm Nicole Brady. The summer is winding down, Olympics coming to an end today, and tomorrow, if you can believe it, Albuquerque public school students will be going back to school. So we wanted to talk about some issues in education today. Joining me, I have Franklin Schargel. If you watch this program, you've seen Mr. Schargel on several times. Thanks for being here again, Franklin.
Thank you for having me. It's delightful to be here.
An author and former educator, Franklin, you've worked as a teacher, principal, administrator, just every aspect of the school system pretty much.
Right, and now I'm writing books and traveling the world delivering workshops. So it's just been I keep on pinching myself.
Excellent.
Never thought.
I have a couple of your books here, and we're going to talk about your newest book in our second segment, actually, a very interesting topic that you'll want to stay tuned for. But first off, let's talk about some of your travels. You've been going to other states and countries recently to see what they're doing in education. What are you observing?
First, I think we need to come back to the reality that if we look at what China and India did, they went from a third world country or countries to becoming global competitors. And what I've seen in China, I haven't been to India, is that they did a laser-like focus on improving their educational system, something we need to do both in New Mexico as well as in in the United States. So one, they've done that. In Vietnam and Cambodia, very interesting systems. One, they take their special education students and they give them core knowledge in the morning, and in the afternoon vocational skills.
Wow.
And that's totally different. In China, elementary school teachers are specialists. In the United States, our elementary school teachers are generalists. They are required to teach mathematics, science, social studies, reading, writing, arithmetic.
Very broad.
Very broad. And so they don't have any specialized knowledge in areas which the president, the Congress, even our state is saying we need to prepare students for the skills they'll need in the 21st century, which are STEM skills: science, technology, engineering, and math. But many of our elementary school teachers don't have science and math skills, so they're
And you're saying in China, I mean, even at the elementary level, these kids are getting a specific focus on those areas right now.
With specialized teachers who have majored in science, who have majored in math, and it's just amazing that if you look at what they've done, if you look at countries like Finland and Singapore, which are countries at the top of the international scale, why are they successful and why are we having difficulty? Well, one, they have a deep respect for their teachers. Their teachers are held in very high regard. They are also spending more money. And by that, we keep on hearing that education is expensive and that the United States spends more money than anyone else. And that's true in absolute dollars. But it's not true when we're talking as a percentage of the gross domestic product, the GDP.
Wow.
We're 37th in the world in educational spending as a percentage of GDP. Cuba spends 18%, we're spending 5%.
Wow.
Norway spends 7.6%, Denmark 8.5%, Finland 6.4%, Israel 7.6%. So the successful countries are spending more money as a percentage, not in absolute dollars.
That's got to come as a surprise to people because we do constantly hear money being thrown at the governor just this past week announced $3.5 million more to help some of the failing schools in New Mexico turn themselves around. So I think a lot of people are frustrated with hearing just more money. Is there a better way that money could be spent then, better allocated, especially at the federal level where you say we're not actually spending up to par with those other countries?
Well, I'm sure that educators would be able to do that. And when we talk about, for example, third grade and promotion, educators are professionals. They spend a great deal of their working day, and there was a report that came out today that says educators are spending 10 hours a day working.
Wow.
So if a professional says to you, these are the skills that you need, then I would listen to a professional. Let's say a doctor tells you that you must go for treatment. Well, he's a professional, she's a professional. You would listen to the professionals. We are basically, I wouldn't say ignoring, but at least putting to the side education as a factor. And of course, this country, we are making educational cuts, and educators are being laid off and they're unsure about their positions. Congress has gone into recess without looking at what the drought looks like or reauthorizing the new education bills. It's
very concerning. Now, kind of, staying on the point about what we're teaching in schools for a moment. What can teachers do? I mean, the up-and-coming group of teachers, especially maybe people who are in college right now pursuing a teaching degree. I mean, what should they be doing? Should they be getting those advanced skills? Should they be focusing on certain areas? How can they prepare themselves, perhaps?
Well, it's a very broad spectrum when we're dealing with K-12. So let me start at the lower end. I think we need to start building a sense of pride into our schools in New Mexico. And there are ways of doing that. I would suggest, and it may be being done right now by some elementary school teachers, to take pictures of all of the students in their classes and put it up on a bulletin board with their names underneath. So that, one, students are recognized for who they are. And then as the days and weeks go by, remove the names and have other students see if they can identify everyone in the class. So there's a sense of pride. At Westinghouse High School, where I worked as an assistant principal, we had a sign in the front, and the sign reads, still there, "Through these doors walk the finest people in the world. Our students, their parents, our faculty, and our guests." That's a no cost. Every school in this state can put up that sign. Every teacher can put that sign over the door of their classroom. "Through these doors walk the finest people in the world, my students." You will have a sense of pride among. In a school I was in Texas, they took the name of every teacher, and outside the room where the teacher was working, they listed where the teacher had graduated from an elementary school, a middle school, a high school, college, what degrees they had, what the name. And so you see teachers walking into the classroom with, a pride. This is who I am. If you go to a doctor, the doctor has their certificate, all their degrees on it.
That's interesting,
I think teachers need to locate mentors. I think every teacher can identify somebody in their school who they admire, who they could learn from. And I think very early in the term, they can go to the teacher and say, "I need assistance. Can you help me?" And again, this is a no cost. It doesn't. It's not additional funding coming from the state or even from the city of Albuquerque.
That's a great point, and I think the teacher and the pride level is a huge part of it. I want to point out something you brought in this graphic. If we can get a shot of it, I'll hold it up. But when we're talking about how important those early years are, this is exactly why. This clearly illustrates the dropout funnel, the fact that we have so many students starting in preschool. I'm not sure if you can read on the screen there, and it funnels out to, well, as you can see on the graphical representation here, one coming out of the university. And you're saying kids are dropping out as early as preschool. That's concerning.
Yes, as early.
At least mentally, if not physically, in all cases.
Arizona State University School of Education issued a report, a longitudinal study that said students start dropping out in kindergarten. There's a reaction to why children, they become school phobic, they get upset stomachs, they are really not, and so the funnel keeps on getting narrower. And then if we look at the students who've dropped out, where do they go? They go to prison. U.S. Department of Justice says 70 to 80% of all of our prisoners are school dropouts. So we either pay for education up front or we pay for the lack of education downstream. And prison, incarceration, is far more expensive than education. I do not know of one area in the United States that spends $40,000 a year to educate. And that's what we're spending per person, and that's what we're spending. That's just really frightening.
It is, and you know, I think people do have a grasp of that now. I mean, obviously in the last couple of years with our administration here, we've seen efforts put toward those early years, and even before that with pre-K. And the latest things we've had coming out of the governor's office have been the attempts to hold students back if they can't read by third grade. A lot of focus on that K through 3 year. In fact, the Albuquerque Journal had a story this week about kids in a K through 3 plus program spending 5 extra weeks of their summer in class to give them an advantage and give them an edge going back to school. Are those good ideas? I think all the things we're seeing coming out of Santa Fe?
I think if we look at what has happened, we are still using an educational calendar, which is an agrarian calendar.
Sure.
We still close schools during the summer and during Easter and Christmas breaks, which we call fall, and so that we allow children to go out to plant and harvest. We close schools the day after Thanksgiving, so that children who are off on Thanksgiving can on Friday go. Thanksgiving is a harvest time. They can go out and harvest. Well, we're no longer an agrarian economy, and we need to change that way of educating. So I'm in favor of a 24-hour-a-day school, 365 days a year. And if we look at what the school of the future is going to look like, it's no longer are children going to go to school. Schools are going to come to students. It's already started. We already have online learning. We already have the Khan Academy. We already have all of these different techniques where schools and learning is now coming to students. We need to change the entire paradigm of what we're looking at in education.
Are there, in your travels, have you seen states or countries obviously doing more of that? I mean, year-round schools are still fairly few here in New Mexico. We don't see many year-round schools. We don't see a lot of schools that necessarily go any longer than anyone else. Is that not the case elsewhere?
In some places, they've gone to year-round schools. In some states, they've even changed the formula from 180 days of instruction to 200 days. If we look at Singapore, what Singapore is now calling integrated learning, they have stopped teaching information. Students can get information thanks to Google, the internet, and everything else.
That's it.
What they're doing is they're questioning, how do you apply that information? They're calling it integrated learning. So they give students a project, and the project doesn't say, this is an English project, or this is a science project, because it's when you eat a meal, you don't separate and eat your vegetables and finish your vegetables and then eat your potatoes, and you mix them all together. In education, everything is separate. Well, there's a synergy built if you combine science and math and writing and all of that. So in Singapore, which is again extremely high performing, they're going into integrated learning.
That's fascinating. I want to take a quick break here, but we're going to, when we come back, talk a little bit about your new book, which deals with school violence. And obviously that's a huge issue we've been talking about a lot lately, not just gun violence or the worst kind of violence you can imagine, but bullying, which has been a huge media topic. Stay right here. We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us for Eye on New Mexico today. Once again, we're talking about schools. APS and a lot of schools around New Mexico go back to school tomorrow. We've been talking with Franklin Schargel, an author and educator, former teacher, principal, administrator. He's done it all, talking about how to fix education because it's...
I'm an assistant principal. That's as far as I got.
Okay.
I think people who become principals because they are getting it from all sides are really crazy.
Well, you've been in all areas and seen how schools work in so many ways. And of course, you've seen in other states and countries how they run their schools. Now, your newest book, Franklin, because we've talked about a bunch of your books on the show before, Keys for Teachers, Helping Students Graduate, Preventing Dropouts. Now you're tackling the subject of school violence with the working title right now, Preventing School Violence. Right. And I know you're still in the gathering of research phase of this, but we're finding out some very interesting stuff. I wanted to first talk about this school violence prevention quiz that will be part of your book.
It's the opening. You can't miss it the minute you get.
Yeah, and I took the quiz. It's about, 16 questions here about school violence. Questions like the most violent school incident in American history took place in. Give me the answer. I'll tell you what I had. But
it's called the Our Lady of Angels School Fire, which occurred in Chicago on December 1st, 1958. Wow. Media has never picked it up. Most people will say Columbine or Virginia Tech.
Sure.
92 students died, 3 teachers that were nuns, a boy aged 10.
And it was an arson?
It was
fire?
arson. Boy aged 10 said he set the fire. He took a lie detector test and he passed the test.
Wow. So school violence isn't a new thing, obviously.
No.
That was the late 50s. And I knew that, and I figured by putting Columbine as my answer, I was probably going to be wrong because there have been so many incidents of violence over the years. Are things getting worse? Are things changing? I mean, should people be afraid to send their kids to school?
The answer is no. Schools are safer than they've ever been. And as a matter of fact, school violence has decreased. I hate to pick on your industry, but when an incident breaks out, it becomes front page.
Absolutely.
And school violence becomes an overall over-dominating thing. Well, it isn't. And if we look at data, if we look at child abuse, for example, according to the FBI, most child abuse is familial. It's taking place in the family. It's not school teachers or Boy Scouts or any of that. But we're not picking these things up. But there are certain things that are societal problems that ultimately bleed into schools. And schools cannot avoid dealing with them. For example, suicide. Suicide is the 3rd leading cause of teenage death in the United States.
Wow.
So what happens if a child outside of school commits suicide? That will bleed into the school. And schools have got to really need to be prepared to deal with those topics. Driving, for example. We know the statistic from the insurance companies that teenagers get into more accidents than anyone else by age groups. And they're texting more, and they're texting and they're talking on cell phones, and they're not looking at the road. That needs to be done and discussed as well.
That's a great point. Looking at the topics that you're preparing for your book, it's not just a school shooting. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about bullying, drugs and alcohol, gun violence, internet safety and internet bullying, sexual activity, suicide, gambling even. All of these issues, you're saying schools, even though some of these may not happen in the school, they need to be addressed by the schools.
I was in Canada. I did a session in Calgary and was amazed because a great deal of research is coming out of Canada. Habitual teenage gamblers now outnumber habitual adult gamblers. And we don't think about it. So when educators see in a school lunchroom children playing cards, they may be playing for money. If we're seeing children using internet poker, and that of course diverts attention, where are they getting the money to use that? It just really, and the book that I'm working on basically says not simply identifying the problem, but what can educators, parents, and children do to deal with these problems. It's as much of a what to do book as it is a how to do book.
Well, I'll look forward to seeing that. And I mean, these are important topics, especially because they persist well after we're out of school. We need to, we should all know how to deal with drugs and alcohol and gambling and things like that. Let's talk a little bit about bullying specifically, because it's so talked about now at the national level, all the way up to the White House, a summit this past week addressing bullying. It often feels like no one really has a great answer. We'll hear the policies coming out of the schools that they have no tolerance policies, but then parents are still complaining all the time to us that their kids are being bullied. What do we do?
It's a great question. First of all, the American Psychological Association, in a survey they released, said 18% of all students say they have been verbally bullied. Only 4.5% of students said they were cyberbullied. Cyberbullying is, again, a societal problem. I was in Atlanta waiting for a connecting plane, and there was a cute little girl who was playing with a cell phone. And she was walking by, and I walked over to her and I said, "How old are you?" And proudly she said, "I'm 4." And I said, "Is that your mom's cell phone?" And she said, "No, it's mine." So at age 4, we have children with cell phones. Cell phones are not given by educators to students. It's given by parents.
Right.
And parents have an obligation to monitor their child's performance both on the internet as well on the telephone. And they need to be given instructions not to give away information, that if somebody calls, whether on a cell phone or a landline, that the child shouldn't say, "I'm home alone, mom is not here." Basically, a child needs to be taught, "My mom can't come to the phone now, can I take a message?"
Kind of the old-fashioned
The
way.
old-fashioned way of dealing with things.
Yeah.
So bullying is a problem.
Kids are learning how to use technology early on, but and now cyberbullying kind of happens when we have people on Facebook and social networking sites using those tools to bully, or texting on a phone, as you mentioned.
Or sexting.
Yeah.
And sending out naked pictures. I mean, it's really a dramatic toll on our society.
But you say that cyberbullying isn't the worst offender right now, that most kids who are reporting bullying incidents are still being bullied, verbally abused, face-to-face, physical at times.
Right.
So that's been around forever. I mean, we've had kids have been cruel to kids for as long as kids have been interacting with other kids.
And part of the problem of the titles in the new book is that every time an institution steps back, educators and schools are expected to step forward. And that becomes a problem, because I don't know where they're going to find the time to deal with that, with the high stakes testing and No Child and Race for the Top and all of these new rules. And 2, we haven't been trained. As educators, we haven't been trained. How do you deal with suicide? How do you do grief counseling? How do you do these things even as a counselor?
Yeah. I always think about that when we hear stories about these bullying incidents in our schools in Albuquerque. I think about those teachers. I know they don't want to see that. They want to. They see both sides. They know the problem with the bully and the victim, or sometimes it's both kids that are really the problem. But it does feel like they're kind of stuck too.
Yes, and either we need to provide more time for this, we need to provide additional training. Hopefully the book will help. Because the research I did is there hasn't been a book on school violence written by an educator who's been there, who's been on the ground, on the front lines, since 1985. There have been books on school violence written by psychologists, written by psychiatrists, written by social workers, but educators have not stepped forward and written this book.
Yeah, and I think it's great to look at this problem as in the middle ground aspect of it, instead of looking at just the extremes. We've seen terrible extremes of school shootings that result maybe even from bullying, or suicides, kids committing suicides because they've been bullied. But the vast majority of kids that are dealing with bullying, it's just making their whole school experience a lot worse and harder.
And I've posted on my website, I think this past week, about a 7-year-old child in the state of Michigan who was bullied to death. Yeah. We need to start teaching anti-bullying techniques even in elementary school. We can't wait until middle school, where most of the incidents take place. And we can't simply say it's got to be, for everyone, and we can ignore the problem. We can't ignore the problem. It's become...
And that that comes back to a good question too, is when do you start the teaching the kids about it? And I did get that question right on the quiz about when most bullying incidents happen in middle school.
Right.
And I think all of us remember middle school just not being a very fun time. I think most of us know that. But I don't remember ever getting any lessons in elementary before that on how to deal with any of that.
Right. America has become a very violent country. I have a friend who has just taken over as chief executive officer of Chicago. Chicago's murder rate is up 38%. Chicago, 5,000 plus students in the middle of, by the end of July, had died. 5,000 people in Chicago had died. London, the Olympics, is 5 times larger than Chicago. 53 people died.
Wow.
So we're a violent country.
Yeah, no.
We are paying football players to injure other people. One of the most popular shows on television, it's not on KOB, but it's wrestling. We have violent video games. We have violent films. Violence is a part of an American nature. And so I think it's become more prevalent, even though, again, violent crimes are down. Murder is down. Some crimes are not down. But I think we need to deal and address the problems and address them with our most vulnerable people in the world, our children.
Yeah, early on, teaching kids that anti-violence message. Right. We only have about a minute left, so what would you teach an elementary school student right now in hopes of making sure that they grow up to be a peaceful person, and maybe someone who stands up to a bully if they see an incident happening?
I've been reading reports that say that we need to have students get involved and to stand up to bullies. My recommendation for a child would be to find an adult. If you see somebody in your school being bullied, find an adult who will intervene. I think we also need to put suggestion boxes in schools that are anonymous. To say Johnny Smith has been bullied by, and allow educators to deal with the problem where it has come into the school. But to have students interfere, especially with the violence, I'm afraid of the risk.
Well, we will look for your book, Preventing School Violence, coming out when that happens. Franklin, thank you again so much for being here today. Franklin Schargel. You can get more information on the website you saw on the screen, schargel.com. We'll see you next week for another Eye on New Mexico.